Hello, Axanar fans. This is Pat Doyle here. I'm sitting in for Alec Peters tonight, and so it's just going to be Chris and I on the show this evening, and we're gonna try to bring you a good show. And this is our first time trying it, so we'll see how this goes. How are you doing tonight, Chris?
I am doing pretty good. I realized about 5 minutes ago that we should have called Chandler. This would have been
right.
This would have been an excellent opportunity to have Chandler on the show, and we just totally and completely spaced it.
That's true. He tells a good yarn. So,
He does.
yeah. Well, I'll make a note of that for next time, so we can get him on. I did tell him we at least mentioned him last week about that story. And for everyone to just to sum up that story very briefly. Chandler's a friend of mine. He's a Navy surface warfare officer. He's retired. And we were in an anti-submarine warfare unit a long time ago together. But he had it before I got to that unit. He and a group of sailors, they basically built a giant simulator up here, basically networked computers, that kind of stuff. And they practiced on the drill. It's a Navy Reserve unit. They practiced and they drilled during their drill weekend and, practice tactics and communications and coordinating things and all the different procedures you have to do. But Chandler was also an avid Starfleet Battles player. And so when they went to San Diego to go to the big Navy trainer down there, they had quite a bit of success and sunk an awful lot of fake submarines or simulated submarines in this simulator, and they were quite successful. And he attributes some of that to his experience playing Starfleet Battles and some of the analogies he could make to Starfleet Battles and how he thought it through and stuff. So Chris and I have discussed this and probably thought someday we'll bring him on. We should bring him on the show sometime to talk about that. I thought it would be pretty interesting.
Yeah, I think that would be pretty good.
I think, and if nothing else, it would be a really entertaining story. So, so tonight we're going to talk about a few things. We are going to just discuss a few sort of things going on in science fiction that have come out that maybe a few people here might be interested in. And then Chris has a little talk planned for the last half of the show. I believe you can fill 30 minutes, you think?
Oh yeah, easily.
So we'll go ahead and get started. Hope everybody's doing well tonight. Should be. I like to think this will be a good show. So first off, Chris, what do you think about the new Dune previews that have come out? The trailers.
So I don't know if I'm up to date on them, but I'm liking what I'm seeing so far. Dune, I have kind of a love-hate relationship with Dune, and because on the one hand I really like it, although I don't necessarily like all the places where Frank Herbert went with it. But it's really a pretty good thing. It'll be interesting to see what they do with it. I really like the Sci Fi Channel miniseries that they did back in way
20 years ago, as it turns out.
Yeah, 20 years ago, as it turns out. I thought it was more like 15, but it was 20 years ago for that first one.
Well, you're a little older than me, so time passes a little more quickly for you right now. So.
Well, yeah, and my memory is not as good. I'm older. Yeah. So.
Yeah.
But
20 years to me only feels like 15 to you.
But I really like the miniseries. I wasn't really a particularly big fan of the movie because I just didn't think they did a particularly good job with the movie. And so I'm kind of excited. Well, the proof will be in the pudding. But what I'm seeing so far what I'm seeing so far gives me hope in the ways that the early stills, etc., from the David Lynch version never gave me hope.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I'm definitely hopeful that they tell a good, or that they do the story well and stuff. Now, I haven't read the book for 35 years. I think I read it in 8th or 9th grade. So I don't, I certainly wouldn't be one of the grognards that's going to complain about the shape of a knife or, any number of other real technical details on it. But unfortunately, it's not a sci-fi universe where we see a lot of starship combat. So I haven't delved too deeply into the tactics of the Highliners and their carrying capacity and stuff like that. So
yeah, there's some indications that the Great Houses have military capability, or space going military capability, but it's just sort of mentioned in passing.
Yeah.
I think a lot of the actors in the David Lynch version, right, just wrote that.
Yeah, I see that.
I think a lot of them were pretty good, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they were the right guys for the right role.
Well, and the way they set that up. Actually, one of the things I remember, and this is just a different show, but Blade Runner. I remember the original Blade Runner movie where the Harrison Ford's character sort of narrated a lot of the movie. And then I think I saw a director's cut years later where he didn't do that. And it completely changed the feel of the movie. And I actually found I liked it better, which surprised me because I kind of like that personal narration part of it in theory.
There's something like 6 or 7 different versions of Blade Runner.
Yeah. So I think I have one version on a Blu-ray somewhere. But
yeah, they keep tinkering with it. So, and a lot of people, I mean, it's the director's cut where they got rid of the narration, so that doesn't change it. I was never a real big Blade Runner fan.
Yeah, I mean, I like the movie. I have not seen the 2049. I think I saw part of the 2049 episode or movie, but I've seen parts of it, but not from the beginning. So yeah. Anyway, so I am looking forward to the Dune movie. Do you know when it comes out?
Do we know when any movie comes out these days?
Yeah, well, that's also a good point. Hey, that also brings me up to another change of topic, but about movies, anyways.
Yeah,
the movie Greyhound. I don't know if we talked about Greyhound last week. Have we talked about that one yet?
I don't think we've talked about it on the show. I mean, you and I've talked about it.
Have you had a chance to see it yet?
I have not had a chance to see it. I've seen basically every clip that's on YouTube.
Okay.
There was a couple of historians who did like an hour plus long thing where they basically ripped it to shreds.
Really?
Yeah, they did. But I came away from what they were saying with like 75% of their complaints could have been fixed if they had said it takes place in February of 1943 vice February of 1942.
Oh, okay. Gotcha.
There was other things were different. Like they said, it's a Fletcher class destroyer, and there weren't really most of the Fletchers all ended up in the Pacific. Okay, yeah, Roger that. But they were shooting on a Fletcher class destroyer. I understand why they made it a Fletcher, and I don't think that that's really that big a deal.
No,
but it's good to note. Good to note.
I mean, they got a World War II era destroyer. I mean, sometimes you got to work with what you got in the movies. It's whether it's made up in science fiction.
Yeah.
They're rarely perfect there too. So,
and they talked about Tom Hanks was constantly talking on the sound-powered phone as if it wasn't a sound-powered phone. And it's like, okay, you're right. That's probably, but I mean, he's grabbing the thing that's clearly a microphone. Okay, maybe that fair enough. There was a complaint that Tom Hanks is in his 60s and this captain in the book he was like 42. It's like, okay, so my response to that, he's a 60-some-year-old actor who's playing a 42-year-old guy. Deal with it.
Yeah.
It's called acting.
Well, and they always make, they always make 04s and 05s seem like really old people in the movies, right? Like the Major's always this old gray-haired gruff guy. Really, a Major is like a 32-year-old.
Yeah.
Very frequently. Not to say there can't be some older guys, but I can remember. So I mean, I've been in 05 now for I guess 5 years, and I can remember thinking to myself, "Gosh, they're really making 04s and 05s really young these days." No, it's just me getting older.
Yeah. And the other thing they talked about is the fact that he hadn't had any experience doing convoy escort, despite the fact that there had been lots of convoy escorts we've been escorting convoys for over a year at that point.
Mm-hmm.
So how did he end up without having any convoy escort experience?
Got to be a first time for everything.
Yeah, and to my response, my response to that is that can be fixed with like 2 lines of dialogue.
Yeah. Well,
And
the other thing, if you notice, he's in 04 at the beginning of the movie when he meets the girl, and then he's in 05 when he gets there. So he just got promoted into command.
Yeah,
So,
and the answer as to why he didn't have any convoy experience is like he's a transfer from Pac Fleet.
mm-hmm. Yeah.
The war was ramping up. They transfer somebody from Pac Fleet, and for whatever reason, they transferred him to the Atlantic, and so he's getting to do something that he didn't have to do before. So I thought, I appreciate the fact that the historians were talking about that stuff, and it's good to note that stuff. But the problem that I had was where they said, where their implication was, and therefore it's shit.
Right.
Like I don't have a problem with Apollo 13 had the wrong brand of toothpaste or whatever, because that brand of toothpaste wasn't out in 1969 or whatever.
True.
Yeah. Where it was. Make a notation of the stuff and go on. I remember when Saving Private Ryan came out.
Mm-hmm.
And they did the History Channel, because that was back when the History Channel did history.
Yeah.
For the youngsters in the crowd, the History Channel used to do history.
Yeah.
And they had the show called History or Hollywood,
mm-hmm.
or Hollywood or History, and they brought 3 guys that actually went ashore on D-Day, and one of them was one of the Rangers who climbed the cliffs of Pointe du Hoc.
Wow. Okay.
And so they're asking these guys, like, what'd you think? And they went, good enough. It's like, what? It's like, yeah. There wouldn't have been nearly as much back and forth between the officer and the enlisted guys. Now, that having been said, I've seen the way that usually works, at least in the Navy that I've seen, is like all the enlisted guys have this conversation and the officer just stands around and pretends he doesn't hear any of it. And they just there's just sort of like, we'll pretend when we're not working, we'll pretend that he's not there, and he'll pretend that we're not here, and they'll just sort of like, they have the conversation with themselves, and the officer doesn't. Sometimes you do that. You bring back people who are retired. So and he said, they didn't have particularly good discipline about not profiling themselves against the sky when they were crossing hills. Like, you would never go across the top of a hill if you could avoid it. You'd always be down below the crest so you don't silhouette yourself in the sky. And there is that scene at the end where they're in a town full of stone buildings, and they decide to defend the bridge by like basically putting sandbags in the middle of the street. That's actually my biggest problem.
Yeah, because I think when I was in France, like damn near every building I saw was made of really thick stone.
Yeah, and that was you line up in the buildings and you got clear fields of fire, et cetera, et cetera. That would have been a lot better. So Jim, about the naval details on the last ship, I've actually only watched about half of an episode of it. But I did go online because I was curious about looking around the inside. If you look at the Combat Information Center that they show for that ship, it is correct in its layout, but they like get the walls wrong and stuff like that. There's a lot of stuff that's right in it, but there's a lot of stuff that's wrong. It's like they took the Combat Information Center and said, we need to make it look a little bit more like Star Trek. So rather than have the like gray walls and just sort of monitors that are just sort of like out from the wall, we'll have a wall there with the monitors on the wall, and stuff like that. So it's from just the pictures of CIC, it I'll give it a solid B. I'll give it a solid B. They clearly seen a destroyer Combat Information Center.
So I watched a season or 2 of the show. So I found it entertaining. It was a good show. It's based off a book written in the 1980s of it was a nuclear war then. It was, in that one, instead of a plague that hits the world, it was the nuclear war. And I'd never read the book, but it was but that's basically what it's based off of. I don't remember the author. I'm sure you could look it up if anyone was interested, but I understand it was a good book. So, but I found it to be an entertaining show. But when I watch a TV show, whether it's a hospital drama, a lawyer drama, a crime drama, whatever, it's just entertainment. The only thing I really take seriously is Starship Combat and stuff, and that's where I'll really get really picky and stuff. So.
Yeah, I'm a naval analyst. When I see a Navy, I analyze it.
Yeah, exactly.
And so I am capable of suspending disbelief, but not if you want me. You can either have my brain engaged and I can be analytical about it, in which case I can't suspend disbelief nearly as well, or it can be purely an emotional response, in which case I can suspend it all day long. Mm-hmm. So Alec and I talked about this, I think, on the first show, where Field of Dreams is the perfect example of that. Not a damn thing in that movie that makes the least amount of sense, and it doesn't matter to me because it doesn't engage me intellectually. The Matrix, on the other hand, tries to be a thinking person's movie, but all the thoughts it has to offer you are kind of dumb. And so,
I kind of lost interest in the Matrix pretty early on, so I never.
Yeah. Now, I did talk with a friend of mine who was talking about all the different problems he had with the last ship, and like using a torpedo to blow a hole in, like they blew a hole in a reef so that they could then drive through it. It's like, yeah, no. No, there's a lot of things that make, modern weapons can make holes in ships in part because there's air on the other side. If it's a solid brick, it's a solid wall of rock.
It's not even a very big warhead. Mark 46 torpedo is not even a very big warhead.
That's true.
So kind of makes as much sense to say firing a Sidewinder missile at a city-sized alien spaceship.
Don't get me started on that. That was
right.
They thought it was. It's funny that the movie makers thought that was an air-to-air warfare problem. It's not. It's a strike warfare problem.
Yeah.
It should have been B-52s carpet bombing the top of it.
Yeah, who knows? Maybe they didn't have strong shields on the top.
Yeah, I mean, it's just this idea that you're going to use a 10-pound expanding or whatever they are, 10-pound
rod warhead. Yeah,
to do any damage to that. Even if they didn't have. That's the thing. Other than the nukes. Even if they didn't have shields, all right, shoot the entire inventory at it.
Yeah, maybe the
shield been shooting tomahawks.
Yeah, but yeah, that was good. So,
but it's funny. Speaking of Independence Day for a moment, that actually goes back to one of the things that I've always said. Modern weapons get smarter by getting dumber. And by that I mean is that we know what we're facing against and we program accordingly. And there's been this countermeasure battle that's taken place over a long period of time. And so somebody comes up with this idea of an infrared seeker on a missile. And the counter to that is we'll have a flare. Well, we'll put a 2-frequency seeker on the missile because flares basically burn at 1 frequency, and it's not the same frequency as jet engines, and so we'll use that to discriminate. Well, okay, then we'll change the flare so that it's got different stuff in it. It burns at 2 different frequencies, etc. And so we've gotten really good at coming up with a missile that knows what a jet engine looks like, right? It knows exactly what the target looks like, and it will discriminate away against anything else that isn't the thing that it looks like. Mm-hmm. And so, when Will Smith is fighting those alien fighters, none of his weapons are going to lock on. They're just going to say, "Yeah, you can't fool me. You're not a jet engine."
Yep. And maybe an AMRAAM if they can lock on through the shields. But.
Maybe. But the way I said, this is one of the things that just. Is
actually, I think they did call Fox 3 a few times, if I remember right. I think they did call Fox 3.
Yeah, they did.
So, I mean, you go from, I don't know what a Sidewinder's warhead is, but it's probably small and in the teens as far as pound. An AMRAAM, I don't think is much bigger, if at all. So you're still not talking a lot. And for those of you that don't know, and I'm not an expert on expanding rod warheads, but basically, they've got a set of rods around the explosive. And so when the explosive goes, it sends basically makes this circular saw-like thing that cuts into the airplane, I believe is how that works. Does that sound about right? So you just have these rods that go out and expand, and that's what damages the airplane. It's not necessarily even the warhead.
Some of those warheads use pellets. Some of them use basically it's like metal sheeting that has slices in it, so that like if you've got a metal table, like one of those patio tables that's like little diamonds of metal. Mm-hmm. You know how they make that? Mm-hmm. They've got a sheet of metal like this, and they heat it to the point where they can cut little slits in it, and then they grab it and stretch it out. Mm-hmm. And that's why it's one piece of metal. And so basically some of those warheads have the equivalent of that. So the explosion sort of stretches it out, and now you've got this sort of giant cookie cutter flying through the air. But in some cases, it's just throwing out shrapnel and stuff like that. So basically an air-to-air weapon like that is basically a shotgun shell on the end of a bottle rocket.
So Smoke and Mirrors here says a Sidewinder's 20 pounds, and AMRAAM is 18 kilograms. So,
that's a pretty good size.
Yeah,
18 kilograms is.
But airplanes are an inherently fragile thing generally. So
yeah,
they don't handle explosions very well. So
yeah, they don't. I want to say one of the things that always amazes me about Star Trek, though, is that the number of times in Star Trek where they encounter something they've never encountered before, right? Like these guys call themselves the Cardassians. We've never run into them before, but they are totally and completely able to target their weapon systems. everything's able to target. They're able to do a complete, they're doing cold shots on things they've never seen before. Right. Mm-hmm. If we shoot right here, we can hit the starboard head. All right, do it. And, they can, port washroom. They can do cold shots on things they've never seen before. Whereas, and all their weapons are designed to work in that environment. They never have this situation where they can't get a lock because I don't know what that thing is. I'm not going to lock on it.
Yeah, no, the only thing I would say also, though, is like, say they encounter the Dominion. The Dominion can shoot through the Federation. So in their case, it's more a matter of your defenses are probably not set up or potentially not set up for the enemy's weapons. Just like the Federation had to take a while to adapt to the Borg.
Yeah.
And the Borg adapt their defenses to the Federation. So maybe that's more of how it works in Star Trek. Because a chunk of metal in space with shields is pretty common, apparently, and fairly universal set of technologies.
Everything is just so much more flexible.
Yes. Yeah. Everything is flexible and expandable and configurable. My personal conclusion is that, most of the systems in Star Trek can also handle tremendous amounts of power. You can put all power to the shields or all power to the phasers, that kind of stuff, and help charge them up and do additional damage or have additional protection as necessary.
Yeah, and that's part of the reason why when they take a hit.
Well, you talked about report head so much.
When the ship takes a hit, like 1,000 feet away from it, that's why something on the bridge explodes.
Yep, everything's connected to the bridge.
Yeah.
But anyways, let me circle right back to Greyhound. For those of you who haven't seen it, who are interested in seeing some naval combat. Now, I've only watched it once, but I suspect you could sit there because they spend, I think the movie's 80 minutes long. I think about 75 minutes of it is in combat. So it's a pretty good, tense, interesting movie. And you could probably even, like I said, sit there with a pen and paper. What we'd call that in the Navy is a MO board or a maneuvering board. I'd be curious to sit there with a MO board and see if all the ranges and bearings and stuff like that all ends up making sense over time. That would be a real trick for a movie.
I don't know where the rocks come from, but if you go back, if you go back to last week's episode, I went in earlier today and put in some comments, went through the chat log and responded to some stuff, and included a link to a thing on YouTube that shows one of the many instances of they take a hit and there's damage on the bridge, and all of a sudden there's rocks falling from the ceiling.
Yeah. Let's see. I see a comment here from Joshua Moore, and I apologize. I can't keep up with all the comments and stuff. So I know I'm missing some other good comments, but there's no reason for ships to be firing at each other in visual range, hundreds of kilometers from each other.
Yeah,
hundreds of kilometers should be considered a melee. That's right, because if we get into the technical manual in Star Trek, they talk about the fact that the impulse engines generally run them up to about 25% the speed of light. Doesn't mean that they're always going that fast, but that's still even percentages of the speed of light are really fast. And the phaser range of being effective out to about 300,000 kilometers means you're still passing through that range band pretty quick. And presumably the torpedoes would get photon torpedoes would get some of their speed from the launching ship. And so that would impact your speed, would impact your ability of your torpedoes to hit, I would imagine. So,
and
in TV, they're always, in Star Trek, at least on TV, they're always trying to show the ships in the same shot on screen. I think in my head canon, that's the Hollywood version of actual events. And they were maybe farther away. That's just kind of how I rationalize it.
The 24th century Hollywood isn't any better than 20 or 21st century Hollywood.
Exactly. Yep, exactly.
Yeah, it's interesting. The photon torpedo, the coming out of the, taking on the speed of the ship that's launching them. That, first of all, from a Star Trek technical side, you've got a warp sustainer there that allows them to continue flying at warp. They can't get up to warp by themselves. They can't really accelerate, but they can continue at warp because they have a warp sustainer in it. There's an equivalent sort of idea, though, with modern air-to-air combat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
When you sort of look at the statistics for, say, an AMRAAM, and it says it's got a range of 80 miles, it's like that's totally and completely the wrong way to think about that. Because that range is dependent upon the launching speed and altitude of the platform that is firing the missile, first of all. And when fighter pilots talk about these things, when they have tactical discussions, they don't talk in terms of like the range of an AMRAAM is 80 kilometers or 80 miles or whatever like that. They talk in terms of they have a specialized vocabulary that takes into account the kinematics of the weapon and the firing platform, et cetera, right? Yeah.
A slow airplane at low altitude would have a hard time, I'm guessing, hitting a high altitude supersonic airplane above it, because the launching airplane would only be going, let's say, 200 or 300 knots. If it was going real slow, it's at low altitude, and then it'll burn most of its engine climbing up. I don't know what I don't know any classified information or anything like that. And I don't know what the actual burn time of a Sidewinder is, but.
So they've got, they use phrases like there's special terms like A pole and F pole and no escape zone and things like that to sort of describe these various relationships. And they talk in, it's all about relative relationships, speed and altitude and stuff like that. And it includes things like, at this range, this is the range at which he can't escape my weapon purely kinematically. He might be able to defeat it with electronic countermeasures, but he won't be able to outmaneuver it because my weapon will still have enough maneuver energy at the end. It can pull more. If it's got the speed, it can pull more Gs than the airplane can. And so it will still have the ability to outmaneuver, from a kinematic standpoint, right? That doesn't mean that the seeker logic is going to do it, but just it's going to have the energy to do it. And so, what you're trying to do is like, you want to be in a situation where you can do it to him, but he can't do it to you, and
do unto others before they do unto you.
Yeah. And so beyond visual range air-to-air combat is all about pointing your sensors and understanding those relationships.
Yeah.
It's only when you get to visual range combat, air combat maneuvering, which is where you're the classic, the shooting your watch sort of deal. That's about yanking and banking. At range, it's not about yanking and banking. And I've thought for a long time, this isn't as true for Star Trek, but it's true for other science fiction properties. Like Honor Harrington in particular, I think it's true, that I would expect that professionals would have, they wouldn't necessarily say F pole and A pole and stuff like that, right? Because it's 2,000 years in the future, and those are really old terms. But they would have a vocabulary that it has similar concepts, right? The relevant concepts to spacecraft battles, because it's clear in the Honor Harrington universe that, the speed of the spacecraft that is firing the missile, that's important.
Yeah.
The speed of the missile when it's fired out of the pod is important. Those things matter.
One of the ways to think about it would be if you and I if we're flying at each other head on and we have the same missile with the same acceleration rate, but if I'm going faster than you and I fire a missile and I have more thrust than you also, I fire a missile, my missile will hit you before yours hits me.
Yes.
And if that's important in the tactics of the situation, then great. And then maybe if my ship has more thrust, perhaps I can maneuver out of the way and my missile will hit you first.
And to take it the next step further from that, if you, in the Honor Harrington series, I know that a bunch of people that are listening to this have read Honor Harrington, but one of the things that happens over the course of the series is the development of multi-stage missiles, which give you, one of the features that happens in that series is that they're like air-to-air weapons in that they burn for a certain amount of time, and then once they burn out, they're really kind of limited in what maneuvering they can do afterwards.
Mm-hmm. They're coasting in the air.
They're pretty much kinetic at that point. And so, and the same thing is with the air-to-air weapons, right? They get this big push early on, and they're still moving. They still have fins, but they become in a situation where they can bleed away energy, etc. So in that situation that you described, where one ship's moving faster than the other, it's not only that weapon will get there faster, but it's also that weapon will be closer when it runs out of ability to maneuver.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's not just that it gets there faster, it's that it's opened its maneuver envelope and it makes it harder for the target to evade it.
Yeah, because it still has rocket thrust for simplicity to,
I believe the term is oomph.
To turn and hit the target. Yep, exactly.
Yeah, so it'll still have oomph, and it can still go rocketing down that way. And so I've always sort of expected that there would be sort of a vocabulary like that. We don't really see it in Honor Harrington. I've been thinking about actually suggesting to David that this is going on behind the scenes and trying to sort of develop that a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
And 95% of what I know about beyond visual range air-to-air combat, I know because if you look for beyond visual range air-to-air combat, you find a whole bunch of ex-Air Force fighter pilots who play flight simulators. And they've got all sorts of web pages where they explain all the stuff on air-to-air combat. So you can know this too.
Yeah, and for anyone who's interested in that, you can go to Steam, download DCS World, Digital Combat Simulator, and you can download it for free, actually, and you can get a P-51 and an Su-25 and fly them around. I don't know that the free version comes with any combat capabilities or anything like that, but you get to fly it around, and it's a highly detailed simulator. Like, you need to follow the checklist to turn on the engine in your P-51 and go through all of that. So, and they have F-14. What's that?
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you had stopped. I'm trying to imagine what a battle between a P-51 and an Su-25 looks like.
Yeah, that I don't know, but I suspect you could go in there and do it if you really wanted to. But they've got F-14, F-18, 16, 15, Su-33, 27, MiG-29, MiG-21, all that kind of stuff.
Do they have B-17s and Ju-88s?
I don't believe they do. But maybe we could suggest that to them.
So Pat and I earlier today were talking about the thing that came up last week about the idea of having playing a game where it was just World War II bombers fighting each other. And the more I think about that idea, the more liquored up I get on it. I really want to play that game.
Yeah, so some of that idea comes from Starfleet Battles, where they had talked about the closest analogy that they could make was, imagine World War II bombers slugging it out in a dogfight with each other, and that's kind of Starfleet Battles. You talk about big lumbering airplanes where with 50 calibers or machine guns, which are not really that, very long range compared to the speed of these planes and stuff like that. So the more Chris and I have been talking more about, like, okay, if we changed a couple things in history, say that a couple experiments just worked out a little differently, and maybe
the World War I experience is a little bit different, and fighters don't seem to be as useful, and you get to the interwar period, and the entire basis behind the B-17 Flying Fortress was that it would be self-escorting because it's got all these these guns. Well, what if the bomber guys were right? What if the bomber guy, it turns out that they're just bristling with weapons, and a fighter can't get anywhere near them?
Yeah.
So okay, I have this image. I was telling Pat earlier, I have this image of a big group of B-17s with sort of B-25s in escort roles around the outside of the formation.
Yep. So thought about that. Maybe that would make a fun game somewhere. So there's a question from Jeff Nelson. What about space combat in The Expanse? They have torpedoes followed by rail guns. And then they've also got PDCs once you get in closer, point defense cannons. So I'm a big fan of The Expanse. I really enjoy it.
Yeah. I'm behind. I have not taken advantage of COVID to get caught up on The Expanse. I watched the first 2 seasons, I think, sort of put it aside because I knew that eventually it was gonna. I did the same thing with Game of Thrones, right? Paradoxically, if I know I'm going to watch it, I don't feel like I need to watch it now because I know I'm just going to buy it anyway. So it's not. So then I can just binge watch it, and I just haven't gotten around to binge watching it yet. So one of the things, though, that I do remember from Combat in the Expanse is that in a lot of instances, it seemed to me that some stuff happened at closer ranges than I would expect.
Yeah. So, so they go through combat in several different range bands and stuff.
Yeah.
So it's pretty interesting. Now, episode 4 of season 1. If anyone's interested in space combat, and if you haven't really seen it, go watch that episode. It's called CQB, Close Quarter Battle. And it's the Martian battleship being attacked by a bunch of other smaller craft. And I thought it was just a fantastic episode. So if anyone's interested in seeing kind of how the combat works there, you get to see that, because at first it's this nice stately battle where, the captain of the battleship, she's like, yeah, this isn't going to be a problem. They're launching a bunch of missiles, and they're watching them, the missile or torpedo tracks come towards them. They're not even worried about it. And PDCs, the point defense system starts picking them off and all that kind of stuff. And anyways, and then the battle develops. So it's a really good episode. If you just want to watch a space battle, that's a good one to start with. Someone mentioned not being able to make it through the pilot episode. I kind of get that, because at first if you can just fight through or skip through to episode 4, I would recommend it. So it's ultimately, it gets better and better. At first, I wasn't sure I liked the characters and stuff like that. But I've since gone and read all the books and all the novels. and it is good. And how they did Christiane Avasarala in the books is hilarious. So her dialogue is fantastic in the books.
I need to read the books.
Yeah.
That episode, if I remember correctly, that's the one where you had the railgun rounds poking holes through the ship, right?
Yeah. So essentially, you have rail guns. So the way basically it works, to oversimplify, and I don't necessarily, there's not necessarily the technical 50 years of technical data on it like there is in Star Trek. So all I know is what I've seen in the show. But they start off with torpedoes, and think of them as basically missiles. Missile just kind of drops out into space, pivots and points towards the target, and flies towards it. And then you can shoot down the torpedoes with point defense cannons, and those are just basically, very advanced machine guns, very highly accurate machine guns, and they blow the torpedoes away. And then maybe you fire enough missiles or torpedoes that a couple hits get through, and they're basically nuclear devices. So you pretty much have to shoot them down. They don't have shields or anything like that in this show. Then once you've run dry on missiles, or once you get to closer range, they start using rail guns. Which are, think about basically cannons. Now, a rail gun is basically, they propel, the United States Navy is working on rail guns now. So in 500 years, they probably got the power problems figured out. But basically it uses magnets to propel projectiles at ridiculously high speeds at each other. And they don't necessarily have to be explosive, because all you have to do is poke a hole in a ship. And those they don't shoot down, I believe.
Yeah, I'm okay. So I'm not a physicist. I don't play one on TV, but I do know that, I forget what the rule of thumb is, but it's at some fairly small number of kilometers per second, which is, in the realm of what you're going to get with a railgun. Those railgun rounds are hitting with the explosive force of an equivalent mass of TNT. Mm-hmm. And so you see these instances where they're poking holes through the ship, where what really is probably going to happen is it hits the first substantial thing it hits, it's going to go boom. Mm-hmm. And so instead of getting like this nice hole all the way through, what you're going to get is an explosion followed by spalling.
Yeah. And then people being sucked through as that goes through, unless they've depressurized the thing.
But you're also going to get shotgun blast stuff, because basically.
So the other thing that happens, and then there's some examples where the Rocinante, that's the hero ship in the show, where they get in close to another ship and they're actually fighting each other with PDCs, the point defense cannons. So they're essentially each machine gunning each other. And it's another really good episode. What's that?
With a space station in between.
With a space station in between. Yeah, they're dogfighting and moving in and out. It's actually a really great space battle. So I just don't remember the episode, but it's probably 5 or 6, or maybe it might even be second season. I
think it actually might be third season.
Oh, okay. All right.
I don't think I've seen the episode. In fact, I'm almost positive I haven't seen the episode where that happened. I watched it in the end of season 2, and but I've seen the battle on YouTube.
Yeah. So but it's very interesting in that one. It kind of goes along to what Chris was saying. Later, after the ship is being repaired and they're at the space station, they start going through all the hits and what's her name? Jammer? I can't remember her, the character, but she's the one essentially in charge of the Belters. And she's working on repairing the state, or the Rocinante, and she keeps pointing out, if this PDC round had gone one more inch to the left or the right, your ship would have just exploded. You wouldn't even have known what hit you, And it was interesting because you see them in their chairs and you see rounds, zinging through with the hot metal flying around and all that kind of stuff. So, I mean, never been in space combat myself. I can't say exactly precisely how realistic every aspect of it was, but it's a hell of an entertaining show. Good characters, and I'd highly recommend it for anyone who hasn't seen it.
Yeah, I'm enjoying it. It is not, I'm a naval analyst. When I see a Navy analyze it, there's certainly plenty of places where it's like, what the hell? And like the design of the Rosinante, right? If you're not in a situation where you've got artificial gravity, you're not really interested in having these really big open spaces that if you somehow get knocked off of, you don't have a hold of something and now you're stuck just floating in the middle, right? Or if you're under acceleration, that loft apartment that the pilot sits in is potentially a death trap, because if something happens, if there's a random acceleration and somebody's up there, they can, they're falling a much larger distance. They've got a lot more time to sort of build up speed on their way down, which is, I know it's really the ship building up speed in the other direction. But the main area of the Rocinante just strikes me as being totally and completely designed by Hollywood, not designed by anybody who's an actual ship designer. But okay, in a world where you've got that on the one hand or Star Wars on the other, okay.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, I think it's there's no magic technology in there or anything like that, except for the alien stuff that they find. So if it's probably a closer approximation than most of anything else that we've probably seen in Hollywood. So,
and I'm fully expecting that at no point in this TV show will we see flying robots with buckets of lava.
There you go. All right. So, and I'll throw this out, because The Expanse is, it's a little pirate crew on a cool ship and stuff flying around in their adventures. Speaking of another one of those, there's Firefly. For any Firefly fans out there, if you're on Audible, there are 3 new Firefly novels out, and a 4th one's on its way. So check that out if you're a Firefly fan. I think I had the comic books at one point. I'm not sure I got into the comic books quite as much, but the novels, the reader does a pretty good job. I mean, he doesn't really imitate the voices, but you get the cadence of the voices, and they do the good dialogue. And I think Joss Whedon at least had some involvement in the novels to give it that extra little spin. So anyways, any Firefly fans out there, those are available on Audible if you're interested. I'm not being paid by Audible. I just happen to really like them. So
somebody said it was season 2, episode 2. And I think he means that Battle at the Space Station, yeah. Which means I just don't remember the rest of that episode, apparently.
Yep.
So we did talk about my extreme age earlier in the front, my fighting mental faculties.
Yep. All right. Well, so we've spent 48 minutes doing the preliminary stuff. Chris.
Which we always do.
I'm going to keep us on task tonight and really, really drive it home. So why don't you at least get started to the extent that you can, and maybe we'll pick up the rest of it next week.
That sounds good. So let's see. Let me do that. And let me do that. Okay, you should be able to see it now, right?
No, I still see you.
Oh.
There we go. Okay.
There we go. All right. So so this is a few things that I put together, and realistically, we're only going to be able to do one of these. And I think the right answer is actually to do the useful observation.
Okay, go for it.
So we're going to skip through a bunch of graphics, and we'll do them some other time. And instead, we'll talk about this. Let's hide that. Okay. So this is based upon the Star Cruiser design notes from Frank Chadwick at Game Designers Workshop. Star Cruiser was the tactical space combat game associated with the 2300 role-playing game. And in the design notes, Frank wrote a little section where he talked about the nature of tactical combat and sort of how it changes over time. And I think it's sort of a useful sort of background to think about combat. As Frank points out, tactical combat is really about targeting. It's about knowing where the enemy is and being able to hit them. You're always striving to improve your targeting. So there's a couple of ways that you can improve your targeting. You can increase the precision of fire, or you can increase the volume of fire, right? So I can do a better job of hitting with my one bullet, or I can fire more bullets. Now, okay, you can do both at the same time, right? But those, it's probably better to do both at the same time. But everything that you do is going to fit in one of those two categories. You can increase your precision of fire by improving your knowledge of the enemy's position. So rather than I'm just sort of shooting in that general direction because I know he's in that general direction, I know exactly where he is. You can increase your weapon performance. And that means, like, I can increase my, rather than having a weapon that has a long arc and I have to sort of judge the range as well as judge the distance. Instead, I'm going to have a weapon with a flatter trajectory, and it's going to fly faster, and it's going to be, spin stabilized, right? So like a musket is kind of a wide area device because musket balls, if it's not a rifled barrel, it kind of sprays out, right? Whereas if it's spinning, it's stabilized and it's more likely to fly straight. Or you can increase your weapon control, which is, I can do a better job of aiming. If I'm firing a rifle, maybe that means I've got a scope on, and maybe that means I've got a tripod or a bipod that stabilizes the weapon, so I can control where the weapon fires much better. On the defense, you've got a couple of options. You can decrease the precision of fire. You can do that by using electronic countermeasures. You can do that by using camouflage. You can do that by, not making as much noise so he doesn't know where to look. There's lots of ways that you can decrease you can use smoke, or you can decrease the effective volume of fire, and you can make his rounds ineffective by like armoring yourself so the rounds just bounce off and it's harder for him to actually penetrate. So this kind of summarizes all the different options that you've got there. And first of all, I'll note that Bob Work, when he was Undersecretary of the Navy, he was later Deputy Secretary of Defense, but when he was Undersecretary of the Navy, he wrote this document called Air-Sea Battle Power Projection in the Mature Guided Munitions Era back in 2010, 10 years ago now. He made basically the same argument. He almost entirely the same. In fact, and I know he's a war gamer, so maybe he was reading Chadwick. But he basically he talked about all the same points in this. The only thing that was different in his argument was that he also had a section about how special nuclear weapons are, and about how they sort of change things. But the rest of it was pretty much the same argument. The second thing I would say is that, this is sort of a useful model that you can use for looking at things like, say, for instance, the development of dreadnought warship combat back in the First World War, pre-World War I. So if you read, there's an interesting set of articles by a guy named Karl Lautenschlager, who talks about, one of them is called The Dreadnought Revolution Reconsidered. And he talks about how there really isn't one technology that really sort of describes the increase in capability in dreadnoughts. And he talks about, between pre-dreadnoughts and dreadnought, they doubled the range and they doubled the number of effective hits. Basically, with one ship, they doubled both of those things. So, but it wasn't just one technology. It was a combination of technologies, all of which had been deployed previously. And you had fire control and continuous aim and salvo firing and all big gun and et cetera, et cetera. And so you can go through these different types of things and sort of put them in this model. So a lot of those are increasing the precision of fire. So, fire control is centralized fire control is the ability to sort of, take all your information, process it all together, point all the guns at the same target and fire them all together, and sort of, building in some gunnery computers, etc. Well, that increases the precision of the fire. Salvo firing, if you're really good at it, allows you to increase both the precision of fire because you're giving feedback back to the gunnery computer people, the people in the fire control section. And it also potentially allows you to increase the volume of fire because you're able to, because you're counting, you're not being confused by shell splashes from, well, actually, that's a different thing. You're able to sort of like develop a solution, implement the solution, and then figure out what didn't work because you've assigned individual roles to each of the guns, right? You're spreading out the fire, and like these guys shoot short, these guys shoot middle, these guys shoot long, and then you see how close you got, and you can adjust the aim of everything. So it increases. You can increase the volume of fire because you're able to sort of process the problem faster. Continuous aim increases the precision of the fire because your gun is always pointed where you want it to be pointed. You're not waiting for the roll of the ship to come around and then you have to try to shoot at that point. All big guns have the ability to increase your precision of fire because you're better able to analyze the shell splashes. And it also sort of counters the decreasing the effective volume of fire because it makes the armor less useful. Knowledge of enemy position, the range finding gear that they put in, the optical range finding gear and the centralized fire control all were part of not increasing the knowledge of the enemy position. The big guns at range had better performance. They were flatter trajectory at range for the World War I ranges. Later on, you still had a situation in World War I where you could those guns could physically shoot farther than they could really target out to, which is one of the reasons why they had flat trajectories. And how in the interwar period, one of the first things they did post-war, as fire control developed over the course of the war, they made modifications to the turrets of like the Brits did this. They made modification to the turrets to allow the guns to elevate higher so they could shoot farther, because being able to shoot farther was now important. They could usefully do that. So they increased the range of the guns, but it's the same gun firing the same shell. It just could point higher. So this particular set of observations from Frank is something that I come back to every now and then as I'm trying to sort of think through tactical problems and sort of characterize them. Because I think that this pretty much sums up everything you need to know about the targeting problem. There's useful details that you can put into it, but I mean, it really sort of summarizes the essential elements and how to think about the problem. So, Pat,
yeah,
any thoughts on that?
Well, the applying it to, let's see. So if we were going to apply it to, like, if you're going to apply some of this stuff to a science fiction universe, it would kind of, I suspect how these things would be enacted would sort of depend on the different technological assumptions you're making in your universe.
Mm-hmm.
In Star Trek, in Star Trek, they appear to have faster than light sensors and targeting capabilities. So that means they will know exactly where you are at any given time. So they probably would just have to be able to account for the time it takes for the phaser to get there, about a second or two away. So I think that so yeah, I think you could go through and you could apply some of these different concepts. I think they're all pretty basic foundational concepts that you could apply to just about any Star Trek or any sci-fi universe. And then from there, it's the technological assumptions that you want to make. Is this Babylon 5? Is this, Star Trek with warp drives and everything, where they're traveling at high percentages of the speed of light? And the problem changes a little bit. So yeah, I think, but I think it's a good foundational set of topics or considerations for shooting. But that's the kind of thing that, navies and militaries are constantly doing to each other. I've got a new way to target you, and this is kind of what you talked about with the missiles earlier, right? I've got this new way to shoot at you more accurately. You come up with a defense, I come up with a counter to your defense, and it just keeps escalating on up. And if you can be farther along in that than the opponent when you go to war, then you'll be in a better position. But then maybe next week they'll have figured something else out new, because people are very good at adapting when their lives are on the line. New tricks and strategies and tactics and technical items.
Yeah, and it's important that we not lose sight of the fact that when push comes to shove, skill in your armed forces is really important. I mean, it's very easy to say you've got all this technology, right? Mm-hmm. But when push comes to shove, most of this technology is not a sort of turnkey solution where you can just sort of like take a 23-year-old Chinese, very junior guy, putting him in front of a radar display and say, if this light goes off, push this button, and now you've got the problem solved, right? The computer's not that good.
Yeah.
You need skilled operators in order to make it work, and skilled operators are better able to compensate for things not working the way that they should. Yep. And so the other guy gets a vote. He's going to be trying to sort of muck this up. And a lot of times what ends up happening is the guys that are better skilled are the ones that are just able to compensate for it. It reminds me of an interesting thing that I remember reading about what the, I want to say it was the Taliban, said about fighting the Russians versus fighting the US. With the Russians, it was, you take out the guy who was obviously the leader and nobody else knew what to do. Whereas with the Americans, you take out the guy who's the leader and somebody else just starts barking orders. And it may not actually be the next guy in line, but somebody takes charge. And so you can't decapitate a U.S. unit in the same way that you could the Russian unit. Mm-hmm. So
yeah. Yep.
We're about done.
I think that's we've hit our time for the day. That sounds about good. So I hope everybody enjoyed it. We will, Chris can continue some of this. He had a lot of colored triangles in there. There was actually a point to those, and it was just talking about starships and everything. So he'll go into explanations about that next week, and we will.
And I'll give you two little previews. So one of them is, I guess I have to reshare the screen, don't I? One of them is that question.
To be true. What would have to be true for the submarines in space model of science fiction space combat to be the right model? So yeah, you'd have to have a whole set of tactical or technical and probably tactical assumptions for that to work,
because basically that type of combat is about stealth. And so what has to be true for stealth to be correct? There's one school of thought that says there is no stealth in space. I don't believe it, in part because that has about a page worth of assumptions about your science fiction universe that never get articulated. And I can easily come up with a set of assumptions in about 2 seconds that would totally and completely change that. And the next one is, last week, Alec talked about the warp speed chart. So there's what the warp speed chart looks like, and I kind of want to wait for him to be around before we go through that. So.
Yep. All right. Sounds
good.
I'll
see if I can find one that's a little less blurry.
All right. Sounds good. Okay. Well, that's all we've got for tonight. I hope everyone has a great week, and we will see you all next week. Lissa, I assume you are listening. Take it away.